She was a woman hiding from her past, an unmarried mother who believed the only thing she had to give her son was her own solitude. He was a cowboy, building a future, a man who judged character not by reputation, but by the courage he saw in a person's eyes. In a town that thrived on gossip, their quiet friendship was a dangerous spark. But when he publicly defended her honor and offered her a home, he wasn't just proposing marriage, he was challenging the entire town and asking her to believe in a second chance she thought was long buried. The gunshot had barely finished echoing through the dusty main street of Silveridge when Alina Keller clutched her 3-year-old son closer to her chest and ducked behind the general store's rain barrel. The town's folks were gathered for the annual Founders' Day celebration of 1885. But the festive mood had shattered when Sheriff Tucker's deputy confronted the drunken cattle rustler who'd been causing trouble since sunrise. Elena's heart pounded as she peered around the wooden slats, her golden brown hair falling loose from its careful arrangement. Little Thomas whimpered against her shoulder, his small fingers digging into her threadbare blue dress. "Hush now, sweetheart," she whispered, smoothing his sandy curls. "It'll be over soon." The confrontation settled as quickly as it had begun, with the troublemaker hauled off to the jailhouse, but Eleanor remained hidden, reluctant to rejoin the crowd that had already returned to their marmot. In the 4 months since she'd arrived in Silveridge, she'd learned that staying unnoticed was safest. "Madam, you and the little one, all right back here." Ayla startled at the deep voice instinctively tightening her grip on Thomas. Standing before her was a tall man with broad shoulders dressed in worn riding clothes. A dusty Setson hat sat atop his head, partially shadowing keen hazel eyes that regarded her with concern. "We're fine, thank you," Elena replied stiffly, straightening her spine despite the tremble in her hands, just waiting for the commotion to pass. The stranger nodded, his gaze shifting briefly to Thomas, who had peeked out from his mother's shoulder with curious eyes. "Name's Flynn Lawson," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Just rode into town." "Eleanor Keller," she replied, hesitating before adding, "And this is my son Thomas." Flynn's expression softened as he crouched down to Thomas's level. "Howdy there, young man. That was some loud noise, wasn't it?" Thomas nodded solemnly, his thumb inching toward his mouth before Alina gently intercepted it. "Are you new to Silveridge, Mrs. Keller?" Flynn asked, as he straightened, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Elena's cheeks warmed. "Miss," she corrected quietly, watching as understanding flickered across his face. "We arrived a few months ago. I work at the boarding house on Elm Street." Flynn nodded, his expression revealing nothing of the judgment she'd come to expect. "Well, Miss Keller seems the celebration's continuing. Would you and young Thomas care for some lemonade? Mrs. Whitaker's stand is just around the corner." Eleanor hesitated, conscious of the stares that would follow an unmarried mother with a child, especially in the company of a handsome stranger. But Thomas was looking up at her with hopeful eyes, and the heat of the day was pressing down on them both. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson, but we should be getting back." She declined politely. "Mrs. Thatcher will be expecting me to help serve dinner at the boarding house." Flynn nodded, though disappointment briefly crossed his features. "Another time, perhaps. It was a pleasure meeting you both." As Eleanor hurried away, Thomas's small hand clutched in hers. She couldn't help but glance back at the tall cowboy, who was now being greeted by Sheriff Tucker. There was something about his open gaze that had made her feel, if only for a moment, that she wasn't being judged for the circumstances that had brought her to this remote corner of Wyoming territory. That night, after tucking Thomas into their small bed in the attic room of Ms. Thatcher's boarding house, Elina sat by the window, mending one of her son's shirts by the dim light of an oil lamp. The sounds of the town settling for the night drifted up distant piano music from the Silver Dollar Saloon, the occasional whinny of horses, and the laughter of the men who lingered on the porch of the boarding house below. She recognized Flynn Lawson's deep voice among them, discussing cattle prices with Mr. Jenkins, the local banker. Her needle paused mid-stitch as she caught herself listening for his words for that warm timbre that had addressed her and Thomas with such unexpected kindness earlier in the day. "Foolishness," she whispered to herself, resuming her sewing with determined concentration. A man like Flynn Lawson, strong, handsome, and by the sound of it respected, would have no interest in a woman with her past. And Eleanor had long ago decided that romance was a luxury she could not afford. Not with Thomas to consider, her son was everything to her. The reason she'd fled Chicago with nothing but a carpet bag and barely enough money for train fare. The reason she'd endured the whispers and sideways glances in each town they passed through. The reason she worked from dawn until dusk, scrubbing floors, changing linens, and serving meals at the boarding house for meager wages that barely covered their room and board. Thomas deserved a chance at a good life, far from the scandal that would have tainted his future in Chicago. If that meant Alina would never know the comfort of a husband's love or the security of a proper home, so be it. She had made her choice 3 years ago when she discovered herself with child and unmarried her sweetheart, having disappeared at the first mention of responsibility. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Alina was up before sunrise, helping Mrs. Thatcher prepare breakfast for the boarders. As she set plates of eggs and bacon on the long oak table, she was startled to find Flynn Lawson seated among the regular boarders, deep in conversation with Mr. Daniels, the town's blacksmith. "Good morning, Miss Keller." Flynn greeted her, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "Mr. Lawson?" She acknowledged with a nod, quickly moving on to serve the next plate. She felt his gaze following her movements around the table, and a flush crept up her neck. Despite her best efforts to appear unaffected, seems Mr. Lawson has decided to stay on in Silveridge for a spell. "Mrs." Thatcher announced as she refilled coffee cups. "He's taken the vacant room at the end of the hall." Alina nearly dropped the platter she was carrying. Flynn Lawson staying at the boarding house. The thought of encountering him daily sent a flutter of something dangerously close to anticipation through her chest. "Need any help with that?" Madam Flynn was suddenly beside her, steadying the platter with a gentle hand. The brief contact sent a jolt through Alina that she immediately tried to suppress. "Thank you, but I can manage," she replied, pulling away perhaps too quickly. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check on Thomas." Flynn nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. "Of course. How is the little fellow this morning?" "He's well, thank you," Alina replied, softening slightly at the mention of her son. "Mrs. Thatcher's daughter is watching him while I serve breakfast. He seems like a fine boy," Flynn commented, "strong and curious. Good traits for growing up out here." Pride momentarily overcame Alina's guardedness. "Yes, he is brave too, considering all the changes he's had to adjust to." Flynn seemed about to say more when Mrs. Thatcher called for Alina from the kitchen. With a quick nod, she hurried away, relieved to escape the confusing mix of emotions that Flynn Lawson's presence stirred within her. The following days established a routine that both comforted and unsettled Alina. Flynn would greet her each morning at breakfast, exchange a few pleasantries, and then be off to whatever business occupied his days. She learned from Mrs. Thatcher that he was surveying land to potentially start his own cattle ranch, having worked as a foreman on a large operation down in Colorado. "Man knows his business," Mrs. Thatcher remarked approvingly as they washed dishes one afternoon. "And unmarried too, with prospects. Every eligible young lady in town has taken notice." Alina merely nodded, unwilling to admit that she had indeed noticed more than Flynn Lawson's prospects. She'd noticed how he always tipped his hat to ladies passing on the street, how he'd stopped to help Mrs. Callahan carry her groceries, and how he'd taken to bringing little wooden animals for Thomas, whittled by his own hand during evening hours on the porch. Thomas, unlike his cautious mother, had taken an immediate liking to the tall cowboy. Flynn had a way with children that Alina found both endearing and painful to witness. It was the kind of fatherly attention Thomas deserved, but would likely never know. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Flynn's arrival, Alina was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard Thomas's delighted giggles. Peering around the sheet she just pinned, she saw her son perched atop Flynn's broad shoulders, holding tight to the cowboy's hat as they galloped around the yard. "Hiya, Mr. Flynn. I want to see over the fence," Thomas exclaimed, his usual shyness completely forgotten. "Careful now, partner," Flynn cautioned with a laugh, his strong hands secure around Thomas's small legs. "Don't want to take a tumble and worry your mama." Eleanor stepped into view, torn between interrupting their play and enjoying the rare sound of her son's uninhibited laughter. Flynn spotted her immediately, his smile faltering slightly. "Hope you don't mind, Miss Keller," he said, carefully lifting Thomas down. "Young man here was helping me check the stability of Mrs. Thatcher's fence posts." Thomas nodded earnestly. "We're fixing things, Mama. Mr. Flynn says, I'm a good helper." Ayla smiled, despite herself. "I'm sure you are, sweetheart, but it's nearly time for your bath before bed." "Aw, Mama," Thomas protested, but a look from Eleanor silenced further objections. Flynn ruffled the boy's hair. "Listen to your Mama, Thomas. Maybe tomorrow you can help me mend that loose board by the chicken coop, if it's all right with Miss Keller." "Of course." Both man and boy turned expectant gazes toward Elena, and she found herself nodding before she could consider the wisdom of encouraging this attachment. "Thank you for entertaining him," she said softly as Thomas ran to collect his wooden toys from the porch steps. Flynn's expression grew serious. "It's my pleasure, truly. He's a fine boy, Miss Keller. You've done a remarkable job raising him on your own." The sincerity in his voice caught Elena off guard. She was accustomed to pity, to condescension, even to scorn, but genuine admiration was something new entirely. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Few worthwhile things are," Flynn replied, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than was proper. "But that doesn't make them any less worth pursuing." Eleanor looked away first, unsure if they were still discussing Thomas or something else entirely. "Good night, Mr. Lawson." Good night, Miss Keller," he responded, tipping his hat before turning toward the porch. That night, as Elena lay beside her sleeping son in their narrow bed, she allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what it might be like to have a man like Flynn Lawson in their lives permanently. A steady, kind presence for Thomas, a partner for herself, someone to share the burdens and joys that came with building a life. But by morning, her practical nature had reasserted itself. Men like Flynn didn't marry women with questionable pasts and another man's child. And even if by some miracle he showed interest beyond neighborly kindness, Eleanor couldn't risk Thomas's heart or her own on what would likely end in disappointment. Over the next few weeks, Elena maintained a careful distance from Flynn despite his continued friendly overtures. She made sure she was never alone with him, always ensuring Mrs. Thatcher or another boarder was present during their interactions. If Flynn noticed her deliberate avoidance, he gave no indication, treating her with the same respectful warmth he showed everyone at the boarding house. It was Thomas who inadvertently breached her defenses. One afternoon in early June, Elena returned from delivering fresh linens to the rooms to find her son sitting on the front porch with Flynn, a small book open between them. "Mama," Thomas called excitedly, "Mr. Flynn is teaching me my letters. Look." He proudly pointed to a wobbly T scratched on a small slate. "That's wonderful, darling," Elena said, her heart constricting at the pure joy on her son's face. She glanced at Flynn, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "Hope you don't mind," he said, rising to his feet. "Thomas mentioned wanting to write his name, and I had some time before meeting with Mr. Jenkins about the land purchase." Eleanor hesitated, torn between gratitude for his kindness and concern about Thomas growing too attached. "It's very kind of you to take the time." "Not at all," Flynn replied, his gaze steady. "I enjoy his company. He's quick to learn." Pride briefly overshadowed Elena's caution. "Yes, he is. His father was well. He was well educated." It was the first time she'd ever mentioned Thomas's father to anyone in Silveridge, and she immediately regretted it. Flynn nodded, offering no judgment or prying questions. Education is valuable out here. A man who can read contracts and write letters has an advantage. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I'd be happy to continue helping him with his letters if you're agreeable. I taught the younger ranch hands back in Colorado. The offer was tempting." Elena had dreams of Thomas attending school properly someday, but for now her limited skills were all she could offer him. I would appreciate that she finally said, surprising herself with the admission. "Though I wouldn't want to impose on your time." Flynn's smile warmed his entire face. It's no imposition, Miss Keller. None at all. And so began a new pattern to their days. 3 evenings a week, Flynn would sit with Thomas on the porch after dinner, patiently guiding the boy's small hand as he formed letters and simple words. Elina would bring them lemonade or cookies sometimes, lingering to watch their lessons, finding herself drawn into conversation despite her best intentions to keep her distance. "You're good with him," she remarked one evening, as Thomas proudly demonstrated his ability to write his name. "Have you taught many children?" Flynn shook his head, watching Thomas with genuine affection. "No, mostly just young men needing to sign their names to payroll. But there's something about teaching a child seeing that moment when understanding dawn." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Must be how you feel watching him grow each day." "Yes," Elena agreed, surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them when focused on Thomas. "Though sometimes it happens so quickly, I fear I'll miss something important." "I doubt that," Flynn said. "You notice everything about him. The way he scrunches his nose when concentrating. How his left hand wants to take over from his right when he's tired." He smiled at her surprised expression. "You're a good mother, Eleanor, the best kind." The use of her given name should have alarmed her, should have prompted a retreat behind the walls of propriety she'd built so carefully. Instead, she found herself warming to the way it sounded in his deep voice, spoken with such genuine respect. As June gave way to July, Elena began to notice changes in herself. She found reasons to linger in conversation with Flynn, allowed herself to laugh at his gentle jokes, even shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania. Careful, edited stories that revealed nothing of her time in Chicago or the circumstances of Thomas's birth. Flynn, in turn, told her of growing up on his father's struggling farm in Missouri, of learning ranch work from his uncle after his parents died of fever, of working his way up from stable boy to foreman through determination and an uncanny ability to understand cattle and horses alike. "I've been saving every penny since I was 16, he explained one warm evening as they sat on the porch steps watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard. "Dreamed of my own place, not just working someone else's land, but building something that could last, something to pass down someday." "And now you found it?" Elina asked, genuinely interested in his ambitions. Flynn nodded, his expressions serious yet hopeful. "The land northeast of town along Cottonwood Creek. Jenkins approved the bank loan yesterday. It's rough country, needs work, but the water's good and there's shelter for cattle in winter." He turned to her, something vulnerable in his gaze. "Would you and Thomas like to see it sometime? It's only a short ride out of town." The invitation hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond a simple social call. Elena knew she should decline, should re-establish the boundaries she'd allowed to blur over the past weeks. Instead, she heard herself say, "We would like that. Yes." The smile that spread across Flynn's face made her heart flutter traitorously in her chest. "Sunday after church, perhaps, if Mrs. Thatcher can spare you?" Sunday would be fine. Elena agreed, already wondering if she'd lost her mind entirely. Sunday arrived bright and clear, a perfect Wyoming summer day. After church services, Flynn brought around a wagon he'd borrowed from Mr. Daniels, equipped with a proper bench seat and freshly oiled wheels. "Your chariot awaits," he said with a playful bow to Thomas, who giggled in delight. Elena had worn her best dress, a modest blue cotton with white trim that she'd carefully altered from a second-hand purchase. She'd spent extra time on her hair that morning, pinning it in a neat arrangement that framed her face. The approving look in Flynn's eyes when he helped her into the wagon sent warmth spreading through her, despite her attempts to remain practical about the outing. The ride to Flynn's property took just under an hour, during which Thomas peppered him with endless questions about horses, cattle, and ranch life. Flynn answered each one with patience, occasionally glancing at Elena with shared amusement at the boy's curiosity. "There it is," Flynn finally announced, pulling the wagon to a stop at top a gentle rise. "Lawson land." Eleanor gazed out at the sweeping vista before them. A broad creek meandered through a valley flanked by rolling hills dotted with cottonwood and pine. The land was wilder than the settled areas around Silvage, but Eleanor could see its potential rich grass for grazing natural boundaries formed by ridgelines and the life-giving water of the creek glinting in the sunlight. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely, understanding why this place had captured Flynn's dreams. "Come on," he said, helping her down from the wagon before swinging Thomas up onto his shoulders. "Let me show you where I'm planning to build the house." They walked through meadow grass that reached Thomas's waist, following the gentle slope down toward the creek. Flynn pointed out his plans with infectious enthusiasm. The barn would go there, corrals beyond. The main house would face east to catch the morning sun while being sheltered from the worst winter winds by that stand of trees. And right here, he said, stopping in a level area with a commanding view of the valley, is where the house will stand. Porch wrapping around so you can watch the sunset over those hills. Elena could almost see it, a sturdy home with windows to catch the breeze, perhaps flowers planted along the walkway, children playing in the yard. She caught herself abruptly. They weren't her dreams to share. This wasn't her future to imagine. "It's a fine location," she said, forcing practicality back into her voice. "When will you begin building?" If Flynn noticed her sudden retreat, he didn't comment on it. "I'll start clearing the ground next week. Hope to have at least the barn and a small cabin up before winter sets in." He glanced at her. "It won't be much that first year rough living compared to Mrs. Thatcher's boarding house, but it will be yours," Ella said, understanding completely the value of something that belonged solely to oneself. However humble, Flynn's expression softened. "Yes, mine." He hesitated before adding quietly, "Though a home needs more than walls and a roof to truly be complete," the implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Elena busied herself with brushing grass seeds from her skirt, unwilling to meet his gaze. "Can we see the creek?" Mr. Flynn Thomas's question broke the tension, and Elena silently blessed her son's timely interruption. "Of course," partner Flynn replied, setting the boy down. "Race, you there?" They spent another hour exploring the property, dipping their feet in the cool creek water and sharing the picnic lunch Mrs. Thatcher had packed for them. By the time they loaded back into the wagon for the return journey, Thomas was drowsy with fresh air and excitement curling against Eleanor's side as Flynn guided the horses toward town. "Thank you for today," Eleanor said softly, mindful of her half-leap son. "It's been a long time since we've had such an outing." Flynn glanced at her, his expression serious. "I should be thanking you sharing this place with you and Thomas. It means a great deal to me, Elena." The way he said her name made her breath catch. No one had spoken to her with such warmth in years, not since before Thomas, before the shame and scandal that had driven her from Chicago. "Flynn." She began, uncertain what she wanted to say, but feeling compelled to say something. "You don't need to explain," he interrupted gently. "I know there are reasons you guard yourself and Thomas so carefully. I respect that." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "But I want you to know that whatever came before, whatever brought you to Silveridge, it doesn't matter to me. Not in the way you might think." Ella stared at him speechless. How could he say such things when he knew nothing of her past, of the circumstances that would make most decent men turn away in disgust? "So, you don't know what you're saying," she finally whispered, turning to look at the passing landscape rather than meet his earnest gaze. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Flynn replied, his voice low but firm. "I've met all kinds of people in my years of ranch work, good, bad, and everything in between. I've learned to judge folks by what I see with my own eyes, not by rumors or past mistakes." Elena closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the dangerous hope his words kindled within her. "Some mistakes can't be undone, Flynn. Some choices follow you forever." Flynn was silent for so long that Elena thought the conversation had ended. Then, as the outskirts of Silveridge came into view, he spoke again. "My father used to say that life isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you build afterward." He glanced at her and Thomas with an expression that made her heart turn over in her chest. "And from what I can see, you've built something beautiful and strong against all odds." That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Elena Keller." Before she could respond, they were pulling up to the boarding house, and Mrs. Thatcher was hurrying down the steps to greet them, eager for news of their outing. The moment for further conversation had passed, but Flynn's words echoed in Elena's mind, long into the night, challenging everything she'd come to believe about her place in the world. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to Silvage. Flynn began work on his ranch, riding out each morning before dawn and returning dusty and tired each evening. Elena found herself watching for his return, listening for his deep voice greeting Mrs. Thatcher as he came through the door for supper. Thomas would run to meet him, eager to hear about the day's progress and whatever wildlife Flynn had spotted on the property. Despite his exhaustion, Flynn never failed to spend time with Thomas, continuing their reading lessons and answering the boys' endless questions about ranch life. He began including simple arithmetic in their sessions, teaching Thomas to count fence posts and calculate how many more would be needed to complete an enclosure. Eleanor watched their growing bond with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Thomas had never known a father figure, and seeing him flourish under Flynn's attention was both heartwarming and terrifying. What would happen to her son's tender heart when Flynn eventually found a suitable wife, a woman without Elena's complicated past, and started his own family? These thoughts preoccupied her one afternoon in late July as she swept the boarding house porch. She was so lost in her worries that she didn't notice Mrs. Thatcher joining her until the older woman spoke. "That Lawson fellow has eyes for you. Eleanor Mrs." Thatcher stated, matter-of-factly settling her ample frame into the porch rocker. Has since the day he arrived, Eleanor nearly dropped her broom. "Mrs. Thatcher, please." "Oh, don't Mrs. Thatcher me," the landlord with a knowing smile. "I've been around long enough to recognize when a man's interest goes beyond politeness. The question is, what do you intend to do about it?" Lena resumed her sweeping, focusing intently on a non-existent spot of dirt. "There's nothing to do, mister. Lawson is simply kind to everyone, especially Thomas." Mrs. Thatcher snorted. "Kind indeed. The man rides 10 miles back to town each evening instead of camping at his property because he can't bear to miss seeing you and that boy at supper." She fixed Elena with a penetrating gaze. "Life doesn't offer second chances to everyone, my dear. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to take what's being offered." Elena paused, leaning on her broom as she considered the older woman's words. "It's not that simple, Mrs. Thatcher. You know my situation. I know you're an unmarried mother who's worked herself to the bone caring for her child," Mrs. Thatcher replied firmly. "I also know you're the most honest, hard-working young woman I've had the privilege to employ." She softened her tone. "Whatever happened before you came here, whatever mistakes you think define you, they're part of your past, not your future." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes. "Not everyone sees it that way." "Flynn Lawson does," Mrs. Thatcher stated with certainty. "That man sees you. Eleanor truly sees you. And he sees Thomas too, not as a burden or someone else's child, but as the wonderful boy he is." She rose from her chair with a small groan. "Just something to consider before you sweep away what could be the greatest blessing of your life." With that, the landlady returned inside, leaving Elena alone with thoughts more turbulent than before. That evening, Flynn didn't return for supper. As the hour grew late with no sign of him, Elena found herself growing increasingly concerned. It wasn't until nearly 9:00 after she'd put a disappointed Thomas to bed that she heard the front door open and Flynn's voice greeting Mrs. Thatcher. Relief washed over Elena, followed immediately by embarrassment at the strength of her reaction. She had no right to worry about him, no claim on his whereabouts. Yet she found herself moving toward the stairs, drawn by the need to assure herself he was all right. Flynn stood in the entrance hall, his clothes covered in dust, a smear of dirt across his forehead. He looked exhausted, but satisfied, speaking quietly with Mrs. Thatcher. "The framework's up," he was saying. "Should have walls and a roof by week's end if the weather holds." "That's wonderful news," Mrs. Thatcher replied, noticing Eleanor on the stairs. "Look who's here." Ela was just checking to make sure everyone was locked up for the night. Flynn turned, his tired face lighting up at the sight of her. "Miss Keller, I hope Thomas wasn't too disappointed I missed our lesson tonight." He understood you were busy with the ranch, Elena replied, descending the last few steps. He's left a drawing for you, his idea of what your cattle should look like. Flynn's smile deepened. I'll be sure to review it with him tomorrow. He hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Thatcher, who suddenly remembered urgent business in the kitchen. Once they were alone, Flynn stepped closer to Elena. I actually had a specific reason for being late tonight, he said, his voice lower. I rode into Preston to see about purchasing some furniture for the cabin. It'll be simple at first, but sound. That's wonderful progress, Elena said sincerely. Thomas will be excited to hear about it. And you, Flynn asked, his gaze steady on her face. What do you think about it, Elena? There was something in his tone that made her heart beat faster. I think you're building a fine future, Flynn. He nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. That's my hope. He drew a deep breath. There's to be a social at the church on Saturday to raise money for the new schoolhouse. I was wondering if you and Thomas might accompany me. Ella stared at him, momentarily speechless. A social was different from reading lessons on the porch or even their outing to his property. A social meant being seen together publicly in a way that would invite speculation and gossip. I'm not sure that would be wise, she finally said, though the words felt painful leaving her lips. Flynn's expression remained gentle, but she could see the disappointment he tried to hide. May I ask why? Elena glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone. You know why, Flynn, I'm an unmarried mother. People talk enough as it is without me appearing at a church social with a respectable man like yourself. And if I don't care about such talk, Flynn challenged quietly. You should, Elena insisted. You're establishing yourself here, building a business, a reputation. You can't afford to be associated with someone like me. Flynn took a step closer. Close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. Elena Keller. In the months I've known you, I've seen a woman of extraordinary strength, kindness, and dignity. A mother who would sacrifice anything for her child. A person who treats everyone with respect regardless of station. His voice grew softer. If being associated with someone like you harms my reputation, then there's something deeply wrong with society's judgment, not with you. Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. It's not that simple. It can be, Flynn, replied, his voice steady with conviction. If we decide it is the word, we hung between them, loaded with implications that both thrilled and terrified Elena. Before she could formulate a response, the kitchen door swung open as Mrs. Thatcher returned, giving them both a knowing look. It's getting late, Eleanor said quickly. Good night, Mr. Lawson. She hurried up the stairs, her emotions in turmoil. In the safety of her room, she watched Thomas sleeping peacefully, unaware of the complicated adult world that threatened to append the careful life she'd constructed for them. Part of her, a growing part, wanted to accept Flynn's invitation to allow herself to hope for the kind of future she'd long since abandoned. But years of judgment and rejection had taught Elena harsh lessons about how the world viewed women in her situation. Even if Flynn truly didn't care about her past, now would he feel the same when faced with the inevitable whispers and sidelong glances from the good people of Silveridge Sleep, eluded her that night. And by morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She would maintain a polite distance from Flynn Lawson for his sake as much as for her own and Thomas's. Better a clean break now than heartbreak later when reality inevitably intruded. Her resolution lasted precisely 3 days. On the third morning, Elena was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard Thomas's excited shout from the front of the house. Setting down her basket, she hurried around the building to find Flynn lifting her son onto the back of a gentle-looking pinto pony. "Mama, look!" Thomas exclaimed, his face alight with joy. "Mr. Flynn brought Patches for me to ride." Elena froze, taking in the scene. Flynn stood beside the pony, one hand steadying Thomas, while the other held the lead rope. He looked up at her approach, uncertainty crossing his features as he read her expression. "I should have asked your permission first," he said, immediately contrite. "I just thought he's been so interested in horses and Patches." Here is the gentlest mount I've ever known." Thomas patted the pony's neck with reverent hands. "He's mine, Mama. Really mine." Ela's heart sank. "Thomas, I don't think he'd stay at my place," Flynn interjected quickly. "I teach Thomas to care for him properly on visits. He's old enough to learn responsibility, and there's no better way than caring for an animal that depends on you." Ela struggled to find words that wouldn't crush her son's obvious delight while also maintaining the boundaries she'd resolved to enforce. "It's very generous, Mr. Lawson, but we couldn't possibly accept such an expensive gift." Flynn stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not about the money, Eleanor. It's about giving Thomas something that brings him joy, something I'm uniquely positioned to provide." He glanced at the boy, who was whispering secrets into the pony's ear. "Look at him. Have you ever seen him so happy Eleanor couldn't deny the truth of Flynn's words?" Thomas's face shone with a pure happiness. She rarely witnessed the unguarded delight of a child who for a moment had forgotten the absence of a father. The whispers that followed them, the cramped attic room that was their only home. "I can't repay you for this," she said, her resolve weakening. "I'm not asking for repayment," Flynn replied gently. "Just the chance to be part of his life and yours, if you'll allow it." Elena met his gaze, seeing the sincerity there that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Why Flynn? Of all the women in Silvage, respectable women with unblemished reputations, why would you choose to involve yourself with me and my son? Flynn's expression grew serious. "Because in all my 32 years, I've never met anyone who makes me feel the way you do, Eleanor Keller. Because Thomas reminds me daily of the joy that comes from seeing the world through fresh eyes. Because when I imagine my future on that ranch, it's empty unless I picture you both there with me." Eleanor's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her with such honest emotion, such clear intent. "Flynn, I don't answer now," he interrupted softly. "Just say you'll come to the social on Saturday. Give me that much at least." Ela looked at Thomas, still enraptured with the pony, and then back at Flynn's hopeful expression. Against all her better judgment, she nodded. "Will come." The smile that transformed Flynn's face was worth whatever consequences might follow. Saturday arrived clear and warm, a perfect late July evening. Elena dressed with special care, wearing her best dress, the blue one, that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She arranged Thomas in his Sunday clothes, dampening his hair to control the unruly curls that so resembled his absent father's. As they walked toward the church, Thomas skipping ahead with excitement, Eleanor felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. This would be her first social event in Silveridge beyond Sunday services, where she could slip in quietly and leave immediately after the benediction. Flynn was waiting for them at the churchyard gate, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his usually unruly hair tamed with water and a comb. The smile he gave Eleanor made her momentarily forget her anxiety. "You look beautiful," he said, simply offering his arm. Eleanor hesitated before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of the eyes already turning in their direction. "Thank you for inviting us," she replied, formally, clinging to propriety as a shield. The social was held in the church hall, decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers for the occasion. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small band of local musicians played cheerful tunes in the corner. Nearly everyone in Silveridge seemed to be in attendance, from the oldest widow to the youngest babe in arms. Flynn guided Eleanor and Thomas through the crowd, greeting townspeople with easy confidence. To Elena's surprise, most responded warmly, including them in conversations about weather crops and local gossip, as if their presence together was the most natural thing in the world. Thomas was soon swept away to join the other children in games organized by the preacher's wife, leaving Eleanor and Flynn standing somewhat awkwardly by the punch bowl. "Would you care to dance?" Flynn asked as the musicians struck up a waltz. Elena glanced at the dance floor, where several couples were already twirling. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate." Flynn's expression remained gentle but determined. "One dance, Eleanor, that's all I'm asking." Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Well, if it isn't the boarding house help putting on airs." Mrs. Hargrove, wife of the town's wealthiest merchant, stood nearby with two other women, her expression pinched with disapproval. "Mr. Lawson, I'm surprised to see you in such unconventional company." Elena felt her face burn with humiliation. This was exactly what she had feared, public censure that would tarnish Flynn's reputation by association. Before she could excuse herself, Flynn's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a steadying presence. "Mrs. Hargrove," he acknowledged with cool politeness. "Miss Keller has done me the honor of accompanying me this evening. I consider myself fortunate indeed." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Really, Mr. Lawson, there's no need to maintain such gallantry. Everyone knows the girl's situation." She lowered her voice to a stage whisper. Unmarried with a child, one wonders what other moral failings lurk beneath the surface. Eleanor felt as though she'd been slapped. She began to pull away from Flynn, desperate to escape, but his arm held her firmly in place. "Mrs. Harrove," Flynn said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. "I've worked cattle drives with men who have killed in self-defense. I've broken bread with reformed outlaws and women who once worked in saloons. In my experience, those who have faced hardship and overcome mistakes often possess more genuine character than those who have never been tested." His gaze was unwavering. "Miss Keller has raised a fine son alone, working honest jobs and treating everyone with dignity, even those who offer none in return. I can think of no one whose company I'd rather keep." A hush had fallen over the nearest groups, all pretense of not listening abandoned. Eleanor stood frozen, caught between mortification at being the center of attention and astonishment at Flynn's public defense. Mrs. Hargrove's face mottled with anger. "Well, I never—" "Perhaps you should," Madam Flynn interrupted politely. "Perhaps we all should remember that judgment is best left to the Almighty." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "I believe you promised me a dance in a daze." Eleanor allowed Flynn to lead her onto the dance floor. As his arm encircled her waist and he guided her into the waltz, she finally found her voice. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, though her heart was racing with emotions she couldn't quite name. Flynn's hand tightened slightly on hers. "I meant every word." "Elena, you've made yourself a target for gossip," she persisted. "Your business, my business, will succeed or fail, based on how well I raise cattle, not on whom I choose to court," Flynn replied firmly. Elena stumbled slightly at the word court, and Flynn steadied her, smoothly continuing their dance as if nothing had happened. "Is that what you're doing?" she asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Courting me?" Flynn's eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "I've been trying to for weeks now, though you've been remarkably skilled at keeping me at arm's length." Despite herself, Elena felt a smile tugging at her lips. "I had my reasons." "I know," Flynn acknowledged, guiding her through a turn. "Good ones from your perspective. But Eleanor, at some point, you have to decide whether protecting yourself from potential pain is worth sacrificing potential joy." As they continued to dance, Eleanor became aware that other couples had joined them on the floor, the initial shock of their conversation with Mrs. Harrove fading into the general murmur of the evening. Not everyone approved. She could feel disapproving glances, but there were friendly faces too. Mrs. Thatcher beamed at them from beside the punch bowl. Sheriff Tucker nodded respectfully as he vaulted past with his wife and across the room. Thomas watched with wide eyes, a slow smile spreading across his small face as he observed his mother dancing in the arms of the man who had brought him a pony and taught him his letters. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she'd resigned herself to. A future with laughter and companionship, with a home that belonged to them, with a man who looked at her not with judgment, but with admiration and affection. The music ended, and Flynn reluctantly released her, though he kept her hand in his as they left the dance floor. "Thank you," he said simply. Lena squeezed his hand before letting go. "I should check on Thomas." As she crossed to where the children played, she felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she'd carried for years had begun to ease. Perhaps Mrs. Thatcher was right. Perhaps life did occasionally offer second chances to those brave enough to seize them. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Elena found herself included in conversations with women who had previously only nodded politely in church. Thomas regaled Flynn with tales of his adventures with the other children, his natural shyness forgotten in his excitement. Even Mrs. Hargrove kept her distance, though her disapproving glances followed Eleanor throughout the hall. As the evening drew to a close, Flynn walked Eleanor and a sleepy Thomas back to the boarding house, the boy riding on his shoulders for the last block when his small legs grew too tired to continue. "I had a wonderful time," Elena admitted as they reached the front porch. "Thank you for persuading me to come." Flynn gently lowered Thomas to the ground, keeping one steadying hand on the drowsy child's shoulder. "I hope it's just the first of many such evenings." He replied, his voice warm with promise. Before Eleanor could respond, the boarding house door opened to reveal Mrs. Thatcher, who took in the tableau with obvious approval. "There you are. I was beginning to wonder if you'd run off with the band," she teased, reaching for Thomas. "Come along, young man. Let's get you ready for bed while your mother says goodnight to Mr. Lawson," with a knowing wink at Elena. Mrs. Thatcher ushered Thomas inside, leaving the two adults alone on the porch. "She's not exactly subtle," Elena observed with a small laugh. "No," Flynn agreed, stepping closer. "But she has good instincts about people, about what might bring them happiness." In the soft glow of the porch lantern, Flynn's expression was more serious than Elena had ever seen it. "Eleanor, there's something I need to say, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out completely before responding." Her heart began to race, but she nodded, steeling herself for whatever might come. "These past months, getting to know you and Thomas, have been the happiest of my life," Flynn began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I came to Silveridge looking for land to build a ranch, but I found something far more precious. A woman of extraordinary courage and grace, and a boy whose spirit reminds me daily of the joy in simple things." Elena's breath caught as Flynn took her hands in his. "I know you've built walls to protect yourself and Thomas Walls. I respect for the love that raised them, but I'm asking you to consider lowering them just enough to let me prove that not every man will disappoint you, that not everyone judges based on circumstances rather than character." He drew a deep breath. "The cabin at the ranch will be finished within the week. It's small, just 2 rooms to start, but it's solidly built on good land with clean water and room to grow. What it lacks is a family to make it a home." Elena felt tears pricking at her eyes as Flynn continued, his voice growing more tender. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I know trust comes harder to those who have had it broken before. All I ask is that you consider a future where you don't have to face every challenge alone, where Thomas has someone to teach him to ride and rope, and Reed, where you have a partner who values your strength and beauty equally." "Flynn?" Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you truly understand what you're proposing? The gossip won't stop. It may even worsen if we marry." Flynn finished gently. "Eleanor, I've lived long enough to know that people's opinions matter far less than building a life that brings joy and purpose. The gossips will eventually find new targets, but what we could build together that could last generations. Marriage." The word hung between them simultaneously, terrifying and tantalizing. Eleanor had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood, to raising Thomas alone while working whatever respectable job she could find. The possibility of a husband, a good, kind man who accepted both her and her son, seemed almost too miraculous to contemplate. "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Flynn nodded, bringing her hands to his lips in a gesture of such tender respect that Eleanor felt her resolve wavering. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." In the days that followed, Elena found herself torn between caution and hope. She went about her duties at the boarding house mechanically, her mind constantly returning to Flynn's words on the porch. "Mrs. Thatcher, sensing her distraction, was uncharacteristically patient, taking on tasks that Elena normally handled without comment. Thomas, meanwhile, spoke of little besides Flynn and the pony. "When can we visit Patches again, Mama?" Mr. Flynn said, "I could help feed him special oats." Each mention of Flynn's name sent Elena's thoughts spiraling again. Could she truly trust this unexpected chance at happiness? Was she being selfish to even consider it, knowing the scrutiny and judgment that might follow Thomas throughout his childhood if she married a man who wasn't his father? Yet when she pictured their life continuing as it was moving from town to town, always working for others, always one misstep away from destitution, Elena felt a deep weariness in her soul. Thomas deserved stability, a place to put down roots, a man's guidance as he grew. And what of her own heart? In the quiet honesty of night, Elena admitted to herself that she had grown to care deeply for Flynn Lawson. His steadfast kindness, his gentle humor, his obvious affection for Thomas all had combined to breach the walls she'd built around her heart after Thomas's father had abandoned them both. 5 days after the social, Elena finally made her decision. After putting Thomas to bed, she sought out Mrs. Thatcher in the kitchen, where the older woman was preserving the summer's last peaches. "I need your advice," Elena began, hesitantly taking a seat at the worn kitchen table. Mrs. Thatcher wiped her hands on her apron and joined her, her expression knowing about Mr. Lawson's proposal. "I presume," Lena's eyes widened. "How did you, my dear? These old eyes may be failing, but they can still recognize a man preparing to offer his heart," Mrs. Thatcher replied with a chuckle. "Besides, the walls in this house aren't as thick as one might hope." Blushing, Eleanor pressed on. "I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to accept for Thomas's sake as much as my own, but another part fears I'd be bringing Flynn nothing but trouble and gossip." Mrs. Thatcher considered her words carefully. "Let me tell you something about Flynn Lawson that you may not know. When he first came to town, before he even met you, Mrs. Harrove tried to interest him in her niece, a pretty girl from Denver with a substantial dowry." Elena's heart sank. Of course, someone like Flynn would have other options, respectable women with money and connections. He turned her down flat. Mrs. Thatcher continued, her eyes twinkling. "Said he wasn't interested in arranged matches or dowies. Said when he married it would be for love and character, not convenience." "That sounds like him," Eleanor admitted softly. "The point is," Mrs. Thatcher continued, reaching across the table to pat Elena's hand, "Flynn Lawson knows his own mind. He's not a young boy to be swayed by gossip or intimidated by the likes of Eunice Harrove. If he's chosen you and Thomas, it's because that's truly what he wants." Elena twisted her hands in her lap. "But what if he regrets it later? What if the reality of raising another man's child becomes too difficult?" Mrs. Thatcher's expression grew serious. "Life offers no guarantees, my dear, not to any of us. My Harold and I had 27 wonderful years before influenza took him, but I've never regretted a single day of our marriage, despite the pain of losing him." Her voice softened. "Sometimes, love requires courage. The courage to reach for happiness, despite the risk of pain." As Elena climbed the stairs to check on Thomas before bed, Mrs. Thatcher's words echoed in her mind. Perhaps courage wasn't just about enduring hardship alone, but about being brave enough to accept joy when it was offered. Thomas was sleeping peacefully, his small face relaxed in slumber, one arm wrapped around the wooden horse Flynn had carved for him. Looking at her son, Elena made her final decision. Tomorrow, she would give Flynn her answer. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Elena rose early, helped Mrs. Thatcher prepare breakfast for the boarders, and then asked for permission to take the afternoon off, a request the landlady granted with a knowing smile. Flynn had already left for his property before dawn, as had become his habit. Elena arranged for Thomas to spend the afternoon with Mrs. Thatcher's granddaughter, changed into her blue dress, and set out on foot for the northeastern trail that led to Flynn's land. The walk was longer than she'd anticipated, nearly 2 hours under the August sun, but Elena welcomed the time to order her thoughts. By the time the partially constructed cabin came into view, she felt a sense of calm certainty about the path ahead. Flynn was on the roof, hammering shingles into place. He didn't notice her approach until she was nearly to the porch, calling his name softly. When he looked up and saw her standing there, the smile that transformed his face made Eleanor's heart skip. "Eleanor." He set down his hammer and made his way to the edge of the roof, jumping down with athletic grace. "Is everything all right? Where's Thomas?" with Mrs. Thatcher's granddaughter for the afternoon?" She replied, suddenly nervous now that the moment had arrived. "I hope you don't mind the interruption." Flynn brushed wood shavings from his shirt, his eyes never leaving her face. "I can think of no interruption I'd welcome more," he said softly. "Would you like to see the progress? The roof's nearly finished, and I've started on the interior walls." Elena nodded, allowing him to guide her through the small structure. It was indeed modest, a main room that would serve as kitchen and living area, with a smaller bedroom behind. But the craftsmanship was excellent. The walls solid, the windows perfectly placed to capture both light and breeze. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You've accomplished so much in such a short time." Flynn watched her face closely. It's amazing what a man can do when properly motivated. He hesitated before adding, "There's space for an addition, another bedroom whenever it might be needed." The implication hung between them, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face him directly. "Flynn, I came here today to give you my answer." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected, bolstered by the certainty in her heart. "But first, I need to tell you something about my past that you should know before making such an important decision." Flynn's expression grew serious, but he nodded for her to continue. 3 years ago, I was working as a governess for a wealthy family in Chicago. Elena began the words difficult after so long keeping her story hidden. The eldest son returned from university and paid me special attention. He made promises, marriage, a home of our own. I was young and foolish enough to believe him. Flynn's face remained impassive, though she could see a muscle working in his jaw. When I discovered I was with child, he denied everything. Said I was trying to trap him for his family's money. Eleanor's voice threatened to break, but she forced herself to continue. His parents dismissed me without references. My own family downed me when they learned of my condition. I had nowhere to go, no way to support myself. She looked down at her clasped hands. I worked whatever jobs I could find, seamstress, kitchen help. Each time my situation became known, I would be let go. We moved constantly, Thomas and I always one step ahead of starvation. When she finally looked up, Elena was startled to find not judgment in Flynn's eyes, but a depth of compassion that nearly undid her. "Silveridge is the longest we've stayed anywhere." She finished quietly. "Mrs. Thatcher was the first employer who didn't dismiss me when she learned about Thomas and you." Her voice faltered. "You're the first man who's looked at me since and seen something other than a fallen woman." Flynn closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "What I see, Elena Keller, is a woman of extraordinary courage and integrity. A mother who would sacrifice anything for her child. A person I would be proud to call my wife." Tears blurred Elena's vision as Flynn continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care about the past, yours or mine. I care about the future we could build together, if you'll have me." "Yes," Elena whispered the single word, carrying all the hope and fear and longing of her heart. "Yes, Flynn, I will marry you." The joy that suffused Flynn's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. With gentle reverence, he drew Elena into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. Promise of a life where she would no longer face each day's challenges alone. When they finally parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I'll make you happy, Elena. You and Thomas both, that's my solemn vow." "You already have," she replied, allowing herself to believe at last in the possibility of lasting joy. They stood together in the half-finished cabin that would soon become their home, the afternoon sun streaming through uncurtained windows, casting golden light on the beginning of their shared future. When Flynn asked, his arms still around her waist, as if reluctant to release her now that she'd finally accepted him. "When will you marry me?" Elena laughed, a sound of pure happiness that surprised even herself. "Whenever you wish. We have no family to consult. No elaborate preparations needed." Flynn's expression grew serious. "I want to do this properly, Eleanor, not a hasty ceremony that might feed the gossip's assumptions. I want everyone in Silveridge to understand the depth of my commitment to you and Thomas." His thoughtfulness touched Elena deeply. Even now, he was considering how best to protect her reputation, her dignity. 2 weeks, she suggested, time enough for proper announcements, but not so long that we torture ourselves with waiting. Flynn's smile returned brilliant in its intensity. 2 weeks then, September 1st, the beginning of autumn, and the beginning of our life together. Hand in hand, they walked outside to survey the land that would be their home. The rolling hills, the clear running creek, the stands of cottonwood that would shelter them through winter storms and summer heat. Eleanor could almost see it as it would be years from now, a larger house perhaps with a garden and chickens scratching in the yard. Thomas growing tall and strong, maybe other children playing nearby. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, noticing her distant gaze. Eleanor smiled up at him. "I'm thinking about beginnings and hope." Flynn's arm tightened around her waist. "There's something I want to show you before you head back to town." He led her toward the creek, where a small clearing nestled among cottonwood trees. "I thought this might be a good spot for the garden you'll want to plant come spring." The simple assumption that she would still be there in the spring that they were planning not just for a wedding but for a lifetime filled Eleanor with quiet joy. "It's perfect. Good morning, son." But sheltered from the afternoon heat. They spent another hour walking the property together, Flynn pointing out his plans and Alina offering suggestions. By the time she needed to start back to town, the future had begun to feel real in a way it never had before. Tangible and within reach rather than a distant, impossible dream. Flynn insisted on accompanying her back to Silvage, unwilling to let her make the long walk alone. They travelled mostly in comfortable silence, hands occasionally brushing, exchanging smiles that held all the wonder of their new understanding. As they approached town, Elena felt a momentary return of her old anxiety. "People will talk when they hear of our engagement." "Let them," Flynn replied simply. "We know the truth of our feelings, and that's what matters." His confidence bolstered Elena's courage. By the time they reached the boarding house, she was ready to face whatever reactions might come. Mrs. Thatcher took one look at their clasped hands and beamed with satisfaction. "Well, it's about time," she declared, embracing Elena warmly. "I was beginning to think you'd both be stubborn forever." Thomas, playing on the parlour floor with wooden blocks, looked up at the commotion. "Mama, did you see Mr. Flynn's house? Is it big enough for Patches to live inside?" Elena laughed, kneeling beside her son. "No, sweetheart. Patches will have his own special house called a stable. But I have something important to tell you." She glanced up at Flynn, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Flynn has asked if we would like to come live with him at his new ranch. He's asked me to be his wife and you to be his son." Thomas's small face scrunched in concentration as he processed this information. "Would we live in the house with the creek, where the frogs sing at night?" "Yes," Flynn answered, crouching down to Thomas's level. "And you'd have your own room, and Patches would be right outside in his stable, and we'd be a family. Would you like that?" "Thomas," the boy's expression grew serious. "Would I call you P?" Elena's breath caught at the directness of her son's question, but Flynn didn't hesitate. "I would be honored if you did," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But only when you're ready. Until then, you can call me Flynn." Thomas considered this gravely before declaring, "I think I would like to live where the frogs sing and Mama smiles more when you're here." From the mouth of babes, Elena thought her heart overflowing as Flynn gathered them both into his strong embrace, completing a circle that had been broken for far too long. News of their engagement spread through Silvage with predictable swiftness. As Eleanor had expected, reactions were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Thatcher and Sheriff Tucker, offered genuine congratulations. Others, particularly Mrs. Harrove and her social circle, made their disapproval evident through pointed snubs and whispered comments. Flynn weathered it all with unwavering dignity, treating Alina with such evident respect and admiration in public that even the most determined gossip found it difficult to maintain their criticism. Thomas, blissfully unaware of adult complications, spoke enthusiastically to anyone who would listen about his new paw and the ranch where he would soon live with Patches the pony. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Elena sewed herself a new dress of soft ivory muslin with lace trim she could just afford from her saved wages. Mrs. Thatcher insisted on hosting a small wedding dinner at the boarding house. After the ceremony, the sheriff's wife organized a group of ladies to prepare a pounding a traditional gift, where each person contributed a pound of household staples to help establish the new home. Through it all, Flynn continued work on the cabin, determined to have it properly finished before bringing his bride and her son home. Elena visited twice more, bringing curtains she'd sewn, and simple dishes purchased from Mr. Hargrove's store, where she was served by the clerk. Mrs. Hargrove being suddenly indisposed whenever Eleanor entered on the morning of September 1st. Elena woke before dawn, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Today, she would become Mrs. Flynn Lawson. Today, she and Thomas would begin a new life as part of a proper family. The possibility seemed so miraculous that she found herself offering a silent prayer of gratitude as she dressed Thomas in his Sunday best. "Are we going to live at the ranch house today, Mama?" Thomas asked as she combed his stubborn curls into some semblance of order. "Yes, sweetheart," Elena replied, her heart full as she straightened his small bow tie. "After the wedding, well, go home with Mr. Flynn with your paw." Thomas beamed at this confirmation, his excitement infectious by the time Mrs. Thatcher came to escort them to the church. Elena's nerves had transformed into quiet joy, a sense of rightness that transcended her lingering doubts about whether she deserved such happiness. The church was more full than Eleanor had expected, with many of Silvage's residents in attendance despite the morning hour. She recognized faces from the general store, the bank, the livery stable people who had been politely distant during her months in town. Now present to witness her marriage, Flynn waited at the altar, tall and handsome in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed into submission. The look on his face when he saw Elena walking toward him, Thomas proudly at her side, held such naked adoration that whispers rippled through the congregation. Reverend Collins smiled benevolently as Elena reached Flynn's side. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying through the small church. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God in this company, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As the familiar words washed over her, Elena found herself focusing not on the congregation or even the minister, but on Flynn's steady gaze and the warmth of his hand holding hers. This was real. This was happening. After years of struggle and loneliness, she was binding her life to this good man who had seen past her circumstances, to the woman beneath. "I, Flynn James Lawson, take thee, Elena Grace Keller, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Flynn's voice rang clear and confident, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it was Elena's turn, her voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. Her commitment absolute, despite the unconventional path that had led them to this moment. After exchanging simple gold bands, Flynn had insisted on purchasing the best he could afford. Reverend Collins smiled broadly. "What God has joined together, let no man put us under. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He nodded to Flynn. "You may kiss your bride." Flynn's kiss was gentle, but unmistakably possessive, a public declaration of his commitment that brought color to Elena's cheeks and caused Thomas to giggle beside them. When they turned to face the congregation, as Mr. and Mrs. Flynn Lawson, Eleanor was startled by the spontaneous applause that erupted. Not everyone joined in Mrs. Harrove, and her circle remained stiffly proper, but enough hands clapped in genuine celebration that Eleanor felt tears of gratitude pricking her eyes. As they moved down the aisle, Flynn with Elena on his arm, and Thomas walking proudly beside them, the newly formed family was met with handshakes and well wishes. Even Mr. Hargrove stepped forward to congratulate them, though his wife remained conspicuously absent. The wedding dinner at the boarding house was a joyful affair with more food than Elena had seen in one place since leaving Chicago. Mrs. Thatcher had outdone herself, preparing Flynn's favorite beef stew alongside fried chicken, fresh bread, 3 kinds of vegetables, and a wedding cake that drew gasps of admiration when it was brought out. Throughout the celebration, Flynn remained close to Alina's side, his pride evident in every glance, every touch of his hand at her waist. Thomas darted between the adults accepting cookies and compliments with equal enthusiasm, occasionally returning to tug at Flynn's sleeve and ask, "Are we going home soon, Pa?" The first time Thomas used the title, Flynn's expression had been so nakedly emotional that Eleanor felt her own eyes filling with tears. Now, as the afternoon waned and they prepared to depart for the ranch, she watched her new husband lift her son onto his shoulders with easy strength, the bond between them already forming into something precious and real. "Ready to see your new home?" Mrs. Lawson Flynn asked, offering his free hand to Alina as they walked toward the wagon he decorated with ribbons and wildflowers for the occasion. "More than ready, Mr. Lawson," she replied, the new name feeling both strange and right on her tongue. The journey to the ranch was filled with Thomas's excited chatter and Flynn's patient responses. Eleanor sat close to her husband on the wagon seat, occasionally catching his eye with private smiles that held promise for the quiet moments they would share later when Thomas was asleep. As they approached the property, Alina gasped in surprise. During her last visit, the cabin had still been a work in progress. Now it stood complete with smoke curling invitingly from the stone chimney curtains visible in the windows, and a proper porch with 2 rocking chairs facing the sunset. "Welcome home," Flynn said softly as he helped her down from the wagon, his eyes searching hers for approval. "It's beautiful," Alina whispered, overcome by the reality of what had seemed impossible just months ago. A home of her own, a husband who cherished her security for her son. Thomas had already scrambled down and was racing toward the small stable where Patches greeted him with a friendly whinny. "Pa, can I show Patches our new house? Can I give him an apple after we get your mama settled?" Flynn called back with a laugh. "Come help carry in the wedding gifts first." Elena stood for a moment, watching her son and husband together their similar postures as they unloaded packages from the wagon. The careful way Flynn showed Thomas how to properly carry even a light bundle. These were the moments she had thought Thomas would never know, learning how to be a man from someone who cared enough to teach him. Eleanor Flynn had noticed her standing still. "Everything all right?" She smiled, brushing away the tears that threatened. "Everything is perfect. I was just taking it in." Understanding crossed Flynn's features, and he crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "This is real," he said softly, seeming to read her thoughts. "This is our beginning." Their first evening as a family was both ordinary and miraculous. They unpacked the wedding gifts, exclaiming over the generosity of their neighbours, linens, kitchen tools, preserved seeds for spring planting, even a handcrafted quilt from Mrs. Thatcher that brought fresh tears to Alina's eyes. Flynn showed Thomas how to care for Patches, teaching him to brush the pony's coat and check his hooves for stones. They shared a simple supper at the new oak table Flynn had built, laughing when Thomas nearly fell asleep in his apple pie. After Eleanor had tucked Thomas into his own small bed in the room that would eventually become his alone, once Flynn completed the addition he was already planning, she joined her husband on the porch. The September evening was mild, with stars emerging in a sky still tinged with sunset gold. "Happy?" Flynn asked, taking her hand as they sat side by side in the rocking chairs he'd built during the long summer evenings. "By words," Elena replied honestly. "Flynn, I never thought I would have this a home, a family. After Thomas was born, I believed those dreams were gone forever." Flynn brought her hand to his lips. "I never thought I'd find a woman who would understand what building this place means to me. Someone who could see beyond the rough beginnings to what it could become with love and hard work." His voice deepened. "You're stronger than you know, Elena Lawson. And braver too." The sound of her new name sent a shiver of pleasure through Eleanor. Brave enough to face whatever comes. "We both are," Flynn affirmed, drawing her from her chair into his lap. Together. As his lips found hers in the gathering darkness, Elena surrendered the last of her doubts. The past, with its mistakes and sorrows, would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. That future belonged to her, to Flynn, to Thomas, and to whatever children might bless their union in the years ahead. Here, on this land that Flynn had claimed and transformed, Elina had finally found what she had sought since fleeing Chicago. 3 years ago, not just shelter, but a true home, not just security, but love. As Flynn's arms tightened around her, Elina knew with absolute certainty that the lonely young woman who had arrived in Silvage believing no one would ever want her with a child had disappeared forever. In her place stood Elena Lawson, wife, mother, and beloved. 5 years later, the winter of 1890 had been mild by Wyoming standards, with only 2 major blizzards and enough clear days between storms for Flynn to keep the cattle well fed and healthy. As March brought the first tentative signs of spring to Cottonwood Creek Ranch, Elina Lawson stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching her family with quiet contentment. Flynn was in the corral, with 8-year-old Thomas patiently demonstrating how to properly saddle the new gelding that had replaced Patches, now enjoying a well-earned retirement in the best pasture. Thomas's face was set in intense concentration as he followed his father's instructions, his sandy curls, so like Elina's own, escaping from beneath his small hat. Near the garden fence, 3-year-old Catherine was helping her grandmother Thatcher plant early peas. Her chubby hands more hindrance than help, though the older woman who had sold the boarding house 2 years ago and now lived in the comfortable addition Flynn had built onto their home showed infinite patience with her enthusiastic granddaughter. And in Elina's arms, 2-month-old James slept peacefully, bundled against the March chill, his perfect rosebud mouth occasionally working in dreams of his next meal. "Mama, look," Thomas called out, having successfully cinched the saddle. "P says I can ride to the south pasture with him tomorrow if the weather holds." "Wonderful, darling," Elina called back, smiling at the pride evident in both father and son. Thomas had taken to ranch life with natural enthusiasm, soaking up Flynn's knowledge of horses and cattle like a sponge. Though not his biological son, anyone observing them together would see a bond as strong as blood, perhaps stronger, for being chosen rather than merely inherited. Flynn caught her eye across the yard, his grins still boyish despite the touches of silver appearing at his temples. 5 years of marriage had only deepened Elena's love for this man, who had offered her a second chance at happiness when she'd believed such opportunities forever lost. Their life wasn't perfect. Ranching brought hardships alongside its joys, with drought years and market fluctuations requiring careful management and occasional sacrifice. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger through shared burdens and shared triumphs. The Lawson Ranch had prospered under Flynn's skilled management, expanding from its initial modest holdings to a respected operation that employed 3 permanent hands and additional workers during sieving and branding seasons. The original cabin had grown too, with additions built as their family expanded, first Thomas's room, then Catherine's, now the nursery, where James would eventually sleep when he outgrew the cradle beside his parents' bed. Elena's garden had become legendary in the county, providing not only for their family, but producing enough excess for her to sell preserves and pickles in town for a tidy profit she kept in a special account for the children's education. Mrs. Thatcher's move to the ranch had been a blessing for everyone, giving the older woman the family environment she'd missed since her husband's death, and providing Elina with both companionship and help with the children as the demands of the growing ranch consumed more of Flynn's time. Most surprising of all had been the gradual shift in the town's attitude toward Elina. As the Lawson Ranch prospered and Flynn's reputation as an honest businessman and good neighbor solidified, even those who had initially snubbed their marriage found reasons to reconsider. Mrs. Hargrove had been among the last holdouts. But when Flynn and Elena donated generously to rebuild the church after a lightning strike, even she had grudgingly acknowledged Elena at social gatherings. Now, watching Thomas successfully mount his horse under Flynn's watchful eye, Elina reflected on how differently her life might have unfolded without the courage to accept Flynn's love. Had she clung to her fears, allowed past hurts to dictate her future, she would have missed this rich tapestry of experiences, the joys of partnership, the expansion of their family, the deep roots they'd established in this community and on this land. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Lawson," Flynn said, approaching the porch as Thomas trotted the horse in careful circles within the corral. "Just counting my blessings," Elina replied, shifting baby James to allow Flynn to slip an arm around her waist. "Any particular ones?" he asked, dropping a kiss on her temple before gently brushing a finger over their sleeping son's cheek. Elina leaned into his solid strength, the familiar scent of leather and pine soap that had come to mean home and safety. "All of them," she said simply, "but especially the one that brought a certain stubborn cowboy to Mrs. Thatcher's boarding house 5 years ago." Flynn's laugh rumbled against her side. "Stubborn was I? Persistent," Elina corrected with a smile. "Thank God." Flynn's expression grew serious as he gazed down at her, his hazel eyes as warm with love as they had been on their wedding day. "I knew from that first moment when you were hiding behind the rain barrel with Thomas during Founders Day that you were someone special, someone worth pursuing, no matter how many walls you'd built." Eleanor smiled at the memory of their inauspicious first meeting. "And I thought you were merely being polite to the town's newest charity case." "Never that," Flynn said firmly. "I saw a woman of extraordinary courage facing a difficult world with dignity and grace. A mother protecting her child with fierce love. The kind of partner I'd always hoped to find, but never truly believed existed." The sincerity in his voice still had the power to touch Elena deeply, even after 5 years of marriage. "I love you, Flynn Lawson," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "And I love you, Elena Lawson," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. More with each passing day. As they stood together, watching Thomas's riding lesson, Catherine's gardening adventures, and the peaceful slumber of their newest blessing, Elena felt a sense of completion that transcended mere happiness. This was where she belonged, not despite her past, but because of it. Every step of her journey, even the painful ones, had led her to this place, this family, this love. The unmarried mother who had once believed no one would ever want her with a child had found not just acceptance, but celebration, a love strong enough to overcome prejudice, brave enough to ignore convention, and deep enough to transform two separate lives into something greater than either could have achieved alone. As the spring sun warmed their faces, Flynn and Eleanor Lawson stood together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had created, secure in the knowledge that some loves truly are worth every risk, every struggle, every moment of courage it takes to claim them.